And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of Spirituality and the Self. As you know, Spirituality and the Self is a project of the Multi-Faith Center here at the University of Toronto. We hope the semester is going well for everyone so far and that everyone is keeping warm. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome and thanks for listening. If you've listened to the podcast before, thanks for coming back. We hope you're all enjoying what you've been hearing from us so far, and we'd love to hear from you if you have any comments to share with us. We'd love to know what you think about the topics that we've been speaking about so far, as well as what you think about how the show is going overall, or anything else you might want to share with us for that matter. We are here to enhance your experience on campus this semester in any way we can in our capacity as the hosts of this show. Now, today's topic is another interesting one. It's the topic of spiritual transformation. Specifically, the story of what it's like for someone to discover a religious identity different than the one with which they were raised. So many people take the religion in which they were raised for granted as a part of life, as basic and as obvious to them as eating or drinking. And it's very understandable, given the extent to which religion and personal identity are tied to experience for so many people. However, there are also, of course, people out there who at one time or another, for various reasons, decide that their religious background is no longer for them, and they end up moving to a totally different place. Needless to say, what religion means to people who have come to it in such a way is likely to be very different from what it means to someone who has maintained one particular identity since birth. As one can expect, there are likely to be unique challenges or benefits associated with this kind of religious growth. One such person who has been through this very kind of a religious transformation is Rachel Hearn, one of the leaders of the Spirit Singers choir here at U of T. Rachel was raised in a traditional Christian home and has since found her way to the Unitarian Universalist Church, something listeners may be learning about for the first time here. I was fortunate enough to catch up with Rachel recently in the famous quiet room at the Multi-Faith Center on campus. So without further ado, let's listen to what Rachel Hearn had to say about the topic of religious transformation. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second interview in the series on religious identities on behalf of the Multi-Faith Center at the University of Toronto. Our guest today is former intern at the Multi-Faith Center and one of the leaders of the Spirit Singers choir, Rachel Hearn. Thanks for being here, Rachel.
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. So, before we begin, why don't you just tell the listeners how you would define your religious identity?
So, at the moment, I am affiliating myself faith-wise with the Unitarian Universalist Church. Basically a church that has a set of 7 values that have a lot to do with like social justice and supporting each other on our own spiritual paths and doing good in the world, creating a sustainable world, and recognizing the interdependency of everything that exists.
How long have you had this as your identity?
So this has been an identity that's been forming mostly over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 years. I grew up Christian, and that was a really important identity for me. But as I got older, my beliefs changed, and I just wasn't identifying strongly with the Christian faith anymore. And I wanted to find something a little more broad, and I found Unitarian Universalism, and that was exactly just the right fit for me at the time.
Would you mind telling us a bit more about what that process was like of going from Christian to Unitarian Universalist?
It was a really hard process, actually. For me, it was really painful and sad. There were relatives in my family who were Baptist, so a little more fundamentalist Christian. And so I identified with that sort of strain of Christianity. So I was really passionate about Jesus, and I wanted to tell my friends about Jesus and how awesome he was and how awesome God was, and your life will be better if you have God in your life and everything like that. And then once I got sort of to high school, I started questioning things like how the world was made and just a lot of things about science and history. I sort of came out of that a bit, and it was really hard for me because this was a belief that I had built my life around, and so I couldn't bring myself to believe it anymore was really difficult, and I had to really adjust how I understood the world and like how I could support myself. So yeah, it was a really painful journey, but thankfully, you know, finding the Unitarian Universalist Church and finding other people who had the same questions I did, or who had sort of this same, like a similar journey that I did, it was really helpful to have that support.
Could you tell us a bit about what Unitarian Universalism is all about for those of us who are unfamiliar with it? Maybe a bit about the history or beliefs or anything like that?
Sure. So the Unitarian Universalist Church was actually two different branches. There were the Unitarians and there were the Universalists, and they were both Christian denominations at one point. The Unitarians sort of believed that, well, to my understanding, I'm not sure if this is correct exactly, but the Unitarians believed that if there wasn't such a thing as the Trinity, like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that it was sort of like all one force that was creating and abiding over the universe. And the Universalists believed that God wouldn't send her children to heaven or hell, that we all shared a common destiny. So through time, into about, I think, the 1960s in the States, these denominations started to recognize that their beliefs were actually very similar and that it would be beneficial for them to join together. So they did that, and they became the Unitarian Universalists. And then from there on, the theology of the church changed with time, so that it's not really a Christian denomination anymore, strictly. Some congregations stayed Christian, but most of them have sort of branched out into this wider structure. So how that exists now is basically the church has a set of 7 principles that they abide by, and I'm just going to read them out for you right now because it's short enough. So the first one is the church values the inherent worth and dignity of every person. They value justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The third one is acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregation and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So those are the 7 principles. As you can see, they're pretty broad. They're pretty, I think a lot of people can sort of agree with, with those things. So because of this, the church tends to bring in a wide array of people from all sorts of different spiritual backgrounds. It's common to find Christian Unitarians or Buddhist Unitarians, or atheist Unitarians or Jewish Unitarians. There's like all sorts of different Unitarian Universalists. That's sort of how we draw ourselves together. Also, there's a set of 6 different sources that our church draws from. It's a combination of the direct experience of each person, the experience they bring to the church, the words of all people in the past who have challenged evil and tried to bring about justice. We draw from all sorts of different religious texts. We value science and reasoning and questioning and taking care of the circle of life. Yeah, the interdependency of land and all beings.
Let's just go back to one of the things you said that I found interesting. So you said that because the church is basically built around these broad principles, you attract people of all kinds of different perspectives. So you could have people who are actively Christian or actively believing in a variety of faiths and still choosing to belong to this church. I'm just a little curious, so would these people belong to other churches in addition to this one, or would they sort of use this as their main religious expression?
It depends on the person, really. I know a couple people, I've met people in the past who might have been Christian in a particular denomination, but they moved to an area that was closer to a Unitarian church. So they were kind of going there, and it was working for them at the time. And I know people who sort of go back and forth between maybe, so I know some people who identify as Baha'i, and so they would spend time with both their Baha'i communities and their Unitarian community. So it really depends on the person.
So it sounds to me like there's no particular pattern of who you're going to find in there, right?
In one sense, it sounds like it's this big, broad place where like everyone in the world can exist, but it really does, because of the history in Christianity, it does tend to draw people who are either raised in a Christian home or a Christian culture, or are familiar with Christianity in a sense, because a lot of the congregations, the service would be set up somewhat similar to a Christian church service, even though we're not using the Bible strictly, we're not doing that kind of thing. The structure is very reminiscent of Christianity in some congregations. Some congregations are structured a lot differently. They might be smaller. Everyone might sit in a circle, and there's more discussions or things like that. But there are lots of congregations that are more reminiscent of Christianity, so it tends to draw a crowd that's more familiar with that.
Could you describe what a typical service might look like?
So like I was saying, there are a lot of different structures of Unitarian churches and congregations and rallies or whatever you would call it. But many Unitarian services, basically you would go in, you would sit in chairs, or you would wheel in, however you move yourself, and there's a minister. We call them, from what I know, we call them ministers, and they sort of lead the service. We sing different songs together. We hear a sermon. There might be a choir that sings. And at some point, now this is different depending on the congregation. In the one that I attend, there's a big chalice at the front of the church. There's sand in it, and there's a flame in the middle. And you can line up, and you'll get a small candle, and you can light your candle in the flame in the center, and then place it in the sand around the center flame. And so you do that as it's sort of a ritual that we do every week to center ourselves and to remind ourselves of the light of the universe and the power and the energy that connects us all.
Do you have any particular rituals or practices that draw on the practices or rituals of other religions?
So this is something that is really developing in my life, because at this point I'm still trying to figure out how I want to lead my own spiritual life, and I don't really have a lot of personal spiritual practices. I'm minoring in Buddhism, psychology, and mental health, so I've been learning a lot about Buddhism as a tradition, and I'm really inspired by the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, and basically just being aware of the present moment and everything that's coming up that you're being aware of, and not trying to attach any feelings to those, but just sort of witnessing them at the time. And so that's something that I definitely want to that I've been incorporating into my life. That sort of changed how I see the world and how I relate to other people and to the world. Also, the teaching in Buddhism about how everything is constantly changing. Nothing is constant in the world, even something as solid as a rock. There are tiny particles in that rock that are always very, very slowly and unnoticeable to humans, but they are very slowly moving. So nothing from moment to moment is the same. And so because nothing is ever really the same, change is constant, and it will only cause you suffering if you attach yourself to something, and if you want that to stay the same, because it will never be the same, and you'll be a lot more at peace, and you'll be a lot happier if you can accept that things in life change, and you need to change with them. So that's something that is taught in Buddhist teaching that I've also incorporated into my life. I would say at this point, that's about where my other spiritual journeys have taken me so far, but we'll see what other journeys, what other things I will learn about, and how my spiritual life will change in time.
That's a very thoughtful answer, thank you. Could you describe what holidays are like in your church?
So, this is sort of an interesting one. Unitarians, from what I know, don't really have any specific holidays. We might have, I'm not sure if this is true for Unitarian Universalism all over the world or across North America or whatever, but we have a couple special services every year. So my congregation, around the turn of the new year, we did a fire communion, And basically this is a service where we write on a piece of paper something that we're going to be letting go of in the new year, something that we want to move on from in our lives. We put these thoughts into a fire or into our chalice or whatever, and it's sort of like a ceremony to bring us spiritually and mentally into the new year. There's also a ceremony we do every year called the flower ceremony, and I'll be honest with you, I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's just to mark the coming of spring, the spring equinox, this kind of thing, and we all bring a flower to church and we place it in a vase together, and we can see this big, beautiful bouquet that we've created as a church. And I know it was started by a Unitarian minister in the Czech Republic. I guess it's called Czechia now. Yes, but I don't remember exactly what it is, but I know that that's something that we do every year as well. Like I said, I'm still sort of just getting to know Unitarian Universalism as a tradition, so I'm still learning myself what all of the special rituals and ceremonies and holidays are.
So to get back to the topic of beliefs in general, are there ever times when, since people in the congregation might have different beliefs aside from these general principles, are there ever times when people find their beliefs in conflict with the beliefs of other members?
I would imagine so. I haven't gotten into too many discussions with other Unitarian Universalists. I tend to just go to church and then go home. No, that's not true. Honestly, I've been to a couple youth events, and I've spoken with people at coffee hour and things like that. Yeah, there's definitely times where we'll be having discussions and people will kind of say that's not how I look at it. Or it actually tends a lot to be about people's different level of awareness in terms of human rights and social justice and privilege. This is where I feel like a lot of these conflicts happen. There'll be other members who might not have educated themselves on topics like feminism as much, or race, or things like that. So they'll talk with someone who's a little more knowledgeable about these topics, and they'll say oh, well, I thought this, or I wasn't aware of that, or I think something else. But they're not they haven't learned that much about the topic. So there's going to be those kind of tensions that I've found. Also, there have been times where I've been talking with people who were raised Unitarian, and so their affiliations with certain words, specifically religious words like prayer or God even, they have a different idea of what that word means than I might, because I have a very specific notion of what God is. And so that word has one connotation for me, and for someone else, they don't have those same meanings attached to those words. So we have different relationships with religious words, and it makes it interesting because some people are comfortable using certain words and other people might not be comfortable using those words. So those kind of conflicts come up as well. Those are the only ones that I've really come into contact with so far, but I can imagine there's definitely times where people are going to believe certain things that are different, but I just haven't run into too much of that yet.
It's a very interesting answer. And how about your relationships with people outside of the church? Do you ever find that there's some kind of pushback because your belief is somewhat different from what people might be used to? Or do you find that by and large people with traditional religious backgrounds are accepting of your views?
It really depends. It depends on who you're talking to and how you talk about it, I find. I get a lot of people who will say to me oh, well, if you don't really believe in anything, if your church doesn't really believe in a God or anything, then you don't really have much of a backbone, and it's very wishy-washy, and you don't really stand for anything, so it's not legitimate. Some people, might say that, and that's okay. People, that doesn't matter to me, so it doesn't matter that people will think this. But I've had conversations with other people who are, for instance, very strictly Christian, and if I say that sort of thing to them, then they will, if I say, I know people think this about us, but for me, it's a place where I am comfortable now, and I feel like I found a community where I couldn't find one before, then they're just happy to hear that, and they'll say well, I'm glad it brings together all sorts of different people and things like that. So if you sort of approach it from I understand that you might be thinking this, then they're a lot easier they'll be more likely to, want to work with you and try and find, what's good about this kind of thing.
So take us back to how exactly you first discovered this church and what the process was of discovering that this is for you.
So I was in first year of university, and I was still in my angry atheist phase of I don't believe in God and that kind of thing. But I was really missing my religious life. I missed the church. I missed the kind of people that I met at church. Like, a lot of them, were really trying to be good people and were striving for justice. And I missed being in a community of people like that. I ended up somehow hearing about the Unitarians, and I can't remember how. I think it was through someone I was dating at the time, them mentioning that they'd heard about it or something. I think I'd seen one of those multi-faith boards where basically they have a quote from all of these religions around the world to make the point that all religions are saying the same thing, kind of deal. And I remember seeing one that was oh, Unitarians, what's that? I'd never heard of that before. I went online and I searched Unitarian Universalism Toronto, and a couple of congregations came up. And so I decided to go to the one nearest to me, and I cried through the entire service. I was just overjoyed. It felt very familiar, but it was all the changes that I wished were happening in my former religious life. Those changes had all been made. And I was yes! It was such a great feeling to find somewhere that, it was exactly where I wanted to be. And I was just so overjoyed, and it was great.
Well, I think it's pretty clear from listening to you that despite the fact that you left the traditional religious beliefs that you were raised with, you still obviously are someone who views religion in high regard and as something very valuable. So since this show is about identities and about how religious identities shape people, how do you feel that your Christian upbringing has shaped you as a person, despite the fact that you might not have maintained those beliefs?
I think about that a lot, actually. And so I think one of the most influential things about being raised Christian in the way that I was raised was the teaching of Jesus. The fact that he, hung out with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the people that everyone at the time thought was the lowest of the low in society. And he saw the value in those people and taught everyone to love others and to treat everyone as valuable. That was something that really stuck with me when I was younger and really, really shaped who I am now. And I don't know if I hadn't been introduced to that so heavily, if I would have kept that value in my life as strongly as I have it now. I'm majoring in equity studies, which is all about who is being left out in society and how can we make sure that they are seen just as valuable as everybody else, right? So I think that is something that if I wasn't raised in the Christian tradition, I wouldn't be as strongly of that person as I am today. I also am very involved in a lot of choral music settings, and that was definitely an influence of my Christian upbringing. I don't know if I ever would have gotten into choirs if I hadn't been raised in a lot of Christian settings.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about your life outside of church. You just mentioned that you're into choirs, so have you always been into singing? How did that start?
Yeah, okay, so my family is actually really musical. So my grandmother on my dad's side was the director at the church choir, and that whole side of the family sings. Even today, when we get together for Christmas, we all pull out some carol books and we sing songs together. So we're, and a lot of the people on that side of the family are music teachers, or they run choirs and things like that. So I was definitely bound to be musical in some way, but definitely choral singing was what I liked the most. I like it better than solo singing. I like it better than being in bands. That's sort of my music that I like doing the most.
So could you tell us a bit about what you're doing now with Spirit Singers, and a bit about what the Spirit Singers are as well?
So the Spirit Singers is a multi-faith, multicultural choir that we sing songs primarily with either a focus on social justice and world peace, or that reflect a wide variety of musical styles from around the world. So you might get a song that's in Mandarin, but it might be a love song or something. Or you might get a song in English that's about justice or, that kind of thing. Or you might get a song that's very specific to a certain religious tradition. And we are a student group at U of T. We are sponsored by the Multi-Faith Center and the Center for International Experience. And our members change by the term because there are some people who they can't rehearse on Monday nights because they have class or whatever. So we rehearse once a week, and we have a concert at the end of each term.
We'd like to maybe tell our listeners a bit about where they can find information on the concert if they want to hear you in person.
So we don't have the details for our concert together yet, but you can find us on Facebook. Just look up Spirit Singers, University of Toronto, and you'll be able to find our Facebook page. Or if you look through the Multi-Faith Center's Facebook page, you can find our event information there as well.
Sounds good. We'll definitely link to your Facebook page, and I hope all of you listening will check them out, give them a like, and hopefully check them out in person sometime when you have the chance. I hope you all enjoyed listening to Rachel. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say, and I just want to thank you again for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This was really great.
I appreciate it. And that was my interview with Rachel Hearn of the Spirit Singers Choir, recorded at the Multi-Faith Center Quiet Room at the University of Toronto, a very cool place. I hope you all check out sometime. That whole topic of religious transformation is something very fundamental to the questions we're looking at here, and it's certainly something that's going to come up again in the weeks to come. But one thing in particular that came up was the idea that different people have different concepts of what some basic religious terms such as prayer and even God mean. It's something that I feel is worth exploring and delving into in more detail. Unfortunately, we're out of time today, but I can guarantee that this is something that you have not heard the last of on this program. Darcy and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a great week.